He came only to help me move boxes, but in the quiet weight of his words, "You're stronger than you think," I felt something shift between us that I could no longer ignore. The late afternoon sun poured through the open window of the small apartment, lighting up the dust motes that swirled in the air with every shuffle of cardboard and scrape of taped edges. Her arms ached, her shoulders pulled tight, but she refused to show it. This move wasn't just about furniture and boxes, it was about proving to herself she could stand on her own after months of feeling broken. She tugged at another box, dragging it toward the hallway, when a knock rattled the half-open door. She expected the landlord, maybe a neighbor. Instead, when she looked up, he was standing there, her brother-in-law. Younger than her by nearly a decade, his presence brought a ripple of emotions she didn't have time to untangle. He gave her a small smile, his hands shoved into his pockets as if uncertain he belonged there. "I figured you might need some help," he said, voice casual but eyes steady on her. Before she could protest, he was already lifting the largest box as if it weighed nothing. She wanted to tell him she didn't need rescuing, but watching him maneuver effortlessly through the narrow doorway, she swallowed her words. She grabbed another box, smaller, but heavy enough that it pressed hard against her ribs. He noticed, his brow furrowing. "Careful," he murmured, reaching instinctively when the box tipped in her hands. His palm closed briefly over her wrist, firm and warm, steadying her. The touch lasted only a second, but it left a trail of heat along her skin. They carried boxes up the narrow staircase together, shoulders brushing in the tight space. Each time he passed close, she caught the faint scent of fresh laundry, the kind that reminded her of Sunday mornings and something uncomplicated. It felt out of place in the tangled mess of her life, but comforting all the same. She tried to focus on the task, the scrape of cardboard against the floor, the soft thud of boxes stacked against the wall, but her attention kept slipping back to him. The easy way he carried weight she could barely budge. The way he moved quietly, not demanding thanks, just showing up when she least expected anyone to. And yet, beneath the surface of this simple task, a subtle charge hummed. She couldn't decide if it came from the unspoken history tied to his last name, or the way his nearness pulled her attention in ways she didn't want to name. Either way, by the time they set the last of the boxes in the living room, the space felt fuller, not just with her belongings, but with something new she couldn't quite define. The living room looked like a battlefield of cardboard, half-unpacked boxes leaning against each other, packing paper spilling onto the rug. She brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, her breath coming quick after the climb up the stairs. He set down another heavy box without breaking a sweat and straightened, his broad shoulders filling the space as if he belonged there. She pressed her palms against her thighs, forcing a smile. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. Her voice was casual, but there was a hitch in it she couldn't quite disguise. He glanced at her, shrugging, but his eyes didn't waver. "I didn't want you doing it all alone." The words landed heavier than the box he'd just carried. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. There was nothing romantic in his tone, steady, matter-of-fact, but something about the way he said it made her chest ache. It was simple, protective, and exactly what she hadn't realized she needed to hear. She laughed lightly, trying to cover the fluster that rose in her. "Well, I'm sure you had better things to do on a Saturday." "Not really," he said, lowering himself to sit on the edge of a box. His voice was warm, unbothered. "Besides, I'd rather be here." Her heart gave a traitorous twist. She moved to lift another smaller box, needing to break the moment, but as she shifted it, her fingers slipped, and the cardboard edge cut across her palm. She winced, sucking in a sharp breath. Before she could wave it off, he was there, his hand closing gently over her wrist. His thumb brushed the reddened skin, his touch light but steady. "Careful," he murmured, his voice dipping quieter, almost intimate. The touch should have been ordinary, just concern, just kindness, but it felt like something else entirely. Her skin tingled beneath his thumb, and though she knew she should pull away, she didn't. Instead, she let the silence hang between them, heavy and alive. Their eyes met. His gaze was open, searching, as if he wanted to say something more but didn't trust himself. She was the one who broke away first, her breath catching as she tugged her hand back and busied herself with another box. "Thanks," she said quickly, her voice softer now. He didn't press her. He simply nodded, leaning back slightly, giving her space but never looking away. And in that small, cluttered living room, she realized with startling clarity that his presence made the walls feel closer, the air thicker, the silence louder. Gratitude, yes, but threaded through it was something else she wasn't ready to name. The late afternoon light slanted across the living room, painting the stacks of boxes in gold. She bent to lift another one, smaller than the rest but packed with books that made it deceptively heavy. She braced her arms, tried to stand, and almost laughed at herself when the weight didn't budge easily. He noticed immediately. "Let me get that," he offered, already stepping forward. She shook her head stubbornly, lips tightening in determination. "No. I can manage. I need to do this myself." He paused, hands on his hips, watching as she adjusted her grip and tried again. Her arms trembled slightly, her shoulders straining as the box shifted upward in a clumsy arc. A laugh slipped from her, light and self-conscious. "See? Not as strong as I thought." Before she could drop it, he was beside her, steadying the box with one hand. Their fingers collided on the cardboard edge, brushing in a fleeting, electric touch. She froze, startled not by the contact itself but by the warmth it sparked. His voice lowered, calm but filled with something that carried deeper than the moment. "You're stronger than you think." The words hit her harder than the weight of the books. She lifted her eyes to his, and for a heartbeat, she swore he wasn't talking about boxes at all. His gaze held hers steady, no teasing smile, no hint of irony, just quiet conviction. Her chest tightened. Strength. It wasn't just about her body, and she knew it. It was about the choice to start over, to carry herself through this move, through the past she wanted to leave behind. And in his tone, she heard more than encouragement, she heard belief. The box slid easily from her arms as he lifted it the rest of the way, his hand brushing along hers longer than necessary. The lingering contact sent a ripple down her spine. She stepped back quickly, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could contain the rush of emotion. "Thank you," she murmured, though her voice was barely above a whisper. He set the box down gently on the growing stack, turning back toward her with a faint, almost shy smile. "I mean it," he said, softer now. "Don't forget." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The room suddenly felt too quiet, the air charged with words unspoken. She forced herself to look away, but the echo of his voice lingered, pulsing inside her like a secret reminder, one that would be harder to shake than any weight she had carried that day. By the time they set down the last of the heavier boxes, the apartment looked like a maze. Corridors of cardboard rose on either side, narrow walkways cutting through the clutter. She sank down onto the floor, leaning her back against a box labeled kitchen. The exhaustion hit her all at once, arms trembling, palms sore from gripping tape and cardboard. "Break time," she said, half laughing, half gasping. He gave her a grin and lowered himself onto the floor beside her, stretching out his long legs until their knees nearly touched. The space was tight, forcing them into a closeness that felt both innocent and impossibly charged. She swept her gaze across the mess, cheeks warming with embarrassment. "It's a disaster," she muttered. "Look at this, half my life scattered in boxes, the other half I don't even know where to put." He tilted his head toward her, his expression soft. "I don't mind," he said. "Actually, I kind of like it. It's the real you." The words stole her breath. She turned to him sharply, searching his face for the joke, but there wasn't one. His eyes held hers, steady and unflinching, as if he'd peeled back something private and was content to sit in the truth of it. Her heart gave a slow, uncertain twist. No one had said something like that in a long time, not without expectation, not without judgment. She wanted to deflect, to brush it off with humor, but her throat tightened around the words. Instead, she let out a small laugh that wasn't really laughter at all. "You don't know what you're saying." "Maybe I do," he countered gently. Silence followed, thick but not uncomfortable. The kind of silence where words weren't needed because something else was speaking louder, the quickening rhythm of her heartbeat, the subtle awareness of his presence beside her. Their knees brushed lightly, a passing touch that should have meant nothing. But she felt it. The warmth of his skin through the fabric of her jeans, the tiny reminder that he was right there, close enough that leaning an inch further would collapse the space between them. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his shoulder almost grazing hers. She caught the faint scent of him again, clean soap and something warmer, like cedar, and it wrapped around her senses in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. The boxes around them faded into shadows, the entire apartment reduced to this small corner on the floor. For the first time since the move began, she wasn't thinking about starting over or proving herself. She was thinking about him. The hum of the city outside her window drifted in faintly, the sound of a car passing, a distant bark, the muffled chatter of strangers walking by. Inside the apartment, the world felt too still. She sat with her hands resting in her lap, tracing the faint mark on her palm from where the cardboard had cut earlier. He sat across from her now, leaning back against a box, watching her quietly. She drew in a breath, let it out slowly. The closeness of moments ago lingered, pressing against her chest until she couldn't keep the thought inside any longer. "It feels strange," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head, brow furrowing. "Strange?" She met his eyes for a fleeting second before looking away. "You being here. Helping me. I don't mean that unkindly. It's just," her throat tightened as she fumbled with the words. "You remind me of everything I'm trying to move past." The honesty left her exposed, fragile in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. She braced for him to retreat, to put distance between them. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low, calm. "I get it. And I don't want to make things harder for you. I just didn't like the idea of you doing this alone." The sincerity in his tone unsettled her more than anything. No grand declarations, no expectations, just quiet care. It would have been easier if he had shrugged it off, but the weight of his words pressed into the silence, undeniable. Her hands fidgeted, twisting together nervously. She hadn't realized how her voice had trembled until she felt it again, threatening to rise. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Without hesitation, he reached across the short space between them and took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip gentle but steady, as though he was trying to anchor her. His thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles, back and forth in a rhythm that made her pulse skip. She should have pulled away. She knew that. But her fingers curled around his instinctively, betraying the protest in her mind. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air seemed to thicken around them, heavy with words they didn't dare say. Finally, she forced herself to withdraw, slipping her hand from his with a quiet murmur. It's complicated." His expression softened, a mix of understanding and something deeper he didn't voice. "I know," he said simply. And though he gave her the space she asked for, the ghost of his touch lingered, pulsing against her skin long after it was gone. The last box was heavier than it looked. She tugged it awkwardly toward the corner, her body straining against the uneven weight. He was already beside her, his arm reaching out to take the load, but she shook her head, determined to manage it on her own. "Stubborn," he murmured under his breath, though there was a hint of admiration in his voice. She laughed softly, her foot catching on a stray piece of packing paper as she shifted her stance. The slip was quick but enough to throw her balance. In the same instant, his arms were around her, steadying her before she could stumble further. The world seemed to pause. Her hands pressed against his chest instinctively, feeling the solid warmth beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. His grip tightened at her waist, firm but careful, as if he was both holding her up and afraid to hold her too much. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they stood suspended in that fragile closeness. She became achingly aware of everything, his breath brushing across her hairline, the rise and fall of his chest against her palms, the subtle tremor of restraint in the way his fingers curled into her sides. Her heart pounded, loud enough that she was certain he must feel it. She lifted her head slightly, her gaze catching his. His eyes were closer than they had any right to be, darkened not with intention but with the weight of something unspoken. The air between them was charged, heavy, like the static just before a storm. Neither of them moved, as though any small shift might break the fragile thread holding them together in this suspended instant. She drew in a breath that trembled as it left her. He seemed to notice, his expression flickering with something tender, conflicted. His grip eased slowly, his fingers slipping away from her waist in a careful retreat, as though reluctant to let go but knowing he had to. She stepped back, her hands falling from his chest, leaving behind the faintest trace of warmth that refused to fade. The silence that followed was deafening, full of what might have been said if either of them had dared. Finally, he cleared his throat, turning back toward the stack of boxes with studied focus. "Got it," he muttered, his voice quieter than before. But even as she moved away, her skin still burned where he had steadied her, and the memory of his arms around her clung like an invisible imprint neither of them could erase. The apartment had finally settled into a kind of stillness. The boxes were stacked neatly, the chaos of the afternoon tamed into order. She stood near the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame, her other arm wrapped across her middle as though holding herself together. He lingered a few feet away, glancing around the room as if reluctant to declare the work finished, reluctant to step away from the closeness they'd shared all day. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but steady this time. It wasn't just for the heavy lifting. She hoped he knew that. He turned toward her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me." A pause followed, brief but deliberate. "I meant what I said earlier. You're stronger than you think." The words slipped between them like a gentle current, carrying a weight that left her chest tight. She forced a small smile, but her throat constricted around any reply. For all the things she could have said, "I don't feel strong, not really." "You make it easier to believe I can be," none of them found their way past her lips. Instead, she simply nodded, eyes lowering to the floor, then lifting back to meet his again. The silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable, filled with everything they weren't yet ready to name. He stepped closer, bridging the distance by only a fraction. His hand rose, hesitating for the briefest moment before settling gently on her shoulder. The touch was warm, steady, nothing bold, nothing more than what could be excused as friendly. But it lingered, and she felt it all the way through her, grounding her, as though he'd pressed his reassurance directly into her skin. When he pulled back, the absence of his hand was almost sharper than the touch itself. He gave her a small, almost boyish smile, the kind that reached his eyes but held something unspoken beneath it. "I'll let you get settled," he murmured, his voice low, carrying both finality and reluctance. She watched him step through the doorway, her chest tightening as the air seemed to shift with his absence. The apartment was suddenly too quiet, too empty. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Something had changed. She leaned lightly against the frame after he was gone, fingertips brushing over the place his hand had rested. And though she didn't dare put it into words, she knew, this day, this small series of moments, had opened a door she hadn't expected, one she wasn't sure she could close again.